Mr. Kim, thank you for this conversation with CNN.
Thank you, Daniel.
Last Monday, World Bank declares Chile and also Uruguay as high-income countries for the first time in our history for Chile. As a high-income country now, do we still need the help or the advice of the World Bank?
Well, we have a very long and deep relationship with Chile. And so Chile is not one of the countries that's borrowing a lot of money from us. But, for example, we have a private sector group that's made some very strategic investments in the energy sector and the education sector. And so while they may not need money for loans in the public sector, we have a lot of expertise. For example, we work in so many countries in the world that we have experience in terms of how to improve educational quality. This was one of the themes that came up again and again here in Chile. There's a sense that now people have access to education, but what about the quality of education? Are children from the ages of 2 and 6 really learning and participating in early childhood development programs? Are primary and secondary education programs really accomplishing what they need? And what about tertiary education? You know, one of the issues here in all of Latin America is Latin America has been successful in lifting people out of poverty, but now, as we see in Brazil, people want the next thing. People want to take the next step. People in the middle class now want access to services, want access to education. But the most important thing is they want mobility. They want their children to be able to grow up in a poor village in Chile, for example, but then have the kind of opportunities that will allow them to be doctors and lawyers and maybe presidents of Chile.
The key is not only quality of education, but also that the education is equal for different income families. Is this the biggest problem in Chile now? Inequality in the education?
Well, this is what many people told me. So, of course, we met with a broad cross-section of people here in Chile from the private sector, from think tanks, from NGOs, from the government. And one of the most common themes was we can't be satisfied with where we've gotten to. We can't sit back and say we're a high-income country now. There's nothing left to do. There's a lot left to do. Inequality, social mobility. And in terms of education, here's what we would say. You know, it is a very difficult thing to get education just right. I would say that there's not a single country in the world, and as an educator all my life, as president of a university, former president of a university, we've been looking around, and there's really no system that's perfect. Chile can improve. Chile knows that it has to improve, and we are ready to bring experience from all over the world to help them do just that.
We have a big debate about education in Chile. One of the relevant discussions is if for-profit education should be allowed, and if it should be supported with public funds. Yeah. Which is your opinion?
You know, we work all over the world. And let me just give you an example. In China, this year, 40% of university graduates of China left the university and didn't have a job. And so we've been supporting in China private sector educational institutions that give these graduates very, very basic skills so that they become much more employable. And so the employment rates, after they've come out of public colleges and then gone into these private sector institutions, they have skills that are ready for the market. Now, I think the most important thing here in Chile is to get away from an ideological discussion about public versus private. There is definitely a role for the private sector in education. The private sector can focus on areas that are being neglected today, can be very focused on making sure that if they're going to charge tuition for a product, that product better get people into the employment stream, better be able to be helpful in getting them get jobs. Now, you know, the government has a very important role to play, which is to make sure that the quality of that education is high. But I think there's very much a role for both public and private. We now need to step back, get away from the ideological discussion and say, what role should the public sector play? What role should the private sector play? And again, there are tremendous experiences from all over the world that we can bring to bear to help Chile make the right decision.
And can you have high-quality education with for-profit schools and universities? Which is the international experience about it?
Well, it's tremendously varied. I think there have been some very large private sector institutions that have been incredibly profitable in the United States, for example. But there are real questions now as to whether the indebtedness that was taken on by some of those students is really going to be something that may even become the next bubble in the U.S. economy. That's a real concern. And so I think that the key here is that I wouldn't say that for-profit or not-for-profit is the key indicator. The key indicator for me is, are young people learning, and are they emerging from these institutions with real skills that will make them employable in the future?
But you were president of Dartmouth College. It's an Ivy League institution. With this experience, do you have an example of a for-profit university that is listed among the best in the United States or among the best in the world?
Well, it's not. The model in the United States is quite different. I mean, the rankings of universities are mostly based on the quality of research. There are some rankings that look at the quality of teaching, but most of it's based on the quality of research. And in the U.S., having the top universities involved in extremely complex research programs is critical, and it's also been really helpful in terms of generating innovations that lead to entrepreneurship in the U.S. economy. In China, while the private institutions that we've supported are not the most prestigious institutions in China, we've found that they're filling a really critical niche in the educational world of China, and we're going to continue to support them. We have to be careful about chasing prestige. I hear all the time, Chile has only one university in the top 200. Well, we have to remember what those rankings are about. The rankings are to a great extent dependent on the way professors think about other universities. And so the rankings really are very much focused on research quality. That's really important, but that's not necessarily what every country needs. Every country doesn't need universities that have really highly skilled researchers. There have to be highly skilled researchers in every economy if you want to build innovation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be every university. Most universities have to focus on, especially in developing countries, have to focus on giving young people the skills that they need to be competitive in the global marketplace.
And Chilean universities are giving these skills to young people?
Well, I mean, this is the question that the Chileans are asking right now. I think there are many excellent universities in Chile. But again, if we let universities just simply take their course and, for example, try to replicate models from the United States, I think that universities in developing countries can really get into trouble.
Another big debate in Chile right now is if college education should be free for all students or just for the ones who cannot pay for it. Where do you stand in that issue?
Well, these are very difficult discussions. Let me just tell you how we did it when I was president of Dartmouth College. We provided free tuition for all students whose families made less than $100,000 a year. And so the cost of Dartmouth education is very high. $55,000 is the entire package. So even for people making $100,000 a year, that's very difficult to pay that much for one student's education. So we offer scholarships. And so the way we did it at Dartmouth was we charged a certain price for it. And so the people who could pay $55,000, of course, paid it. But for even people up to $100,000 a year, they didn't have to pay anything for tuition, which made it accessible for everybody. And so we felt very comfortable that no matter how poor you were, if you were a good enough student to get into Dartmouth, we would make sure that you could go through Dartmouth. Moreover, we had programs where, for example, my understanding is that 7 out of 10 college students in Chile are first-generation college students, the first in their families to go to college. We had special programs very much focused on first-generation college students so they wouldn't feel out of place, so that they would have access to the resources they need. If you put all those things in place, then I think charging for a college education is perfectly fine. We were, not only did we accept students who came from poor families, we actively went out recruiting children who came from poor families.
And to provide a free college university for everyone is a good way to invest public funds?
Well, these are decisions that the people of Chile have to decide, and I don't know enough about the tax structure and about the proposals for how they would pay for it. But in the United States and at the best universities in the United States, what we feel is that we need to level the playing field. We need to make sure that everyone can have access to the best education. And the way we did it is through recruitment and providing scholarships. And not just scholarships as an addition. We provided scholarships up to the level to ensure that even the poorest students could attend. I think that's an objective that everyone can agree to. And whether they do it through modifying the current system or doing it in another way through the government, this is not my role to comment upon. But the principles that we had are the people who who truly can pay for it. I mean, we have students whose parents are billionaires, right? They should pay tuition and probably should pay extra to help other students who don't have money to be able to go to those schools. There are many different ways of creating egalitarian systems. But let me put it this way. I think it's important to also move away from focusing too much on who's paying and how the payment is going to go. I think you've got to now really move to say, okay, what kind of higher education system do we want? We want one that's accessible. We want one that's high quality. We want a higher education system that will lay the framework and the groundwork for economic growth in the future. That's the first question that the Chileans have to ask themselves. And then after that, have the discussion about how you're going to pay for it.
In the past 25 years, Chile has been very successful in reducing poverty, but was unable to reduce inequality. What have we done wrong in these 25 years that inequality is still so high?
Well, this is a question I was asking people here from the think tanks. You know, I think salaries have risen. There have been jobs that have been created. The overall gross national income per capita has gone up. There's been growth. There's some concern because the growth estimates are a little bit lower, between 4 and 5%. But still, compared to the rest of the world, Europe is at negative 0.9%. Chile is still doing well. Now, everyone tells me that we've got to face the issue of inequality. And I think the discussions I have had with government leaders and also with people in think tanks, people in the private sector, have been very encouraging because everyone is focused on this. And the formula seems to be pretty straightforward. Really focus on getting access to preschool and early childhood development type activities. Really focus on the quality of primary and secondary education outside of Santiago in the regions. And then make sure that everyone who really for whom it's appropriate has access to high quality higher education, again, to develop the entrepreneurs and the innovators of the future.
Vamos a hacer una pausa y vamos a seguir hablando en CNN con el presidente del Banco Mundial. Estamos de vuelta en CNN conversando con el presidente del Banco Mundial, Jim Yong Kim. Mr. Kim, probably most people will expect that the president of the World Bank is an economist or a politician. You are a physician. How does your professional background fit with your current position?
Well, in fact, there's never been an economist heading the World Bank Group. The former presidents of the World Bank Group have all been either bankers or politicians. Interestingly, I'm the first president of the World Bank Group to have real experience in development. So the World Bank is a bank, and we lend money. But more than anything else, we're a development institution. And we're involved in very focused projects. We've been talking about education. This is one of our areas. And so you wouldn't expect a banker, and sometimes you wouldn't expect a politician, to be concerned about the nitty-gritty details of how developing countries develop their educational systems. But this has been the work I've been doing for 25 years. I've been providing health care in communities like Caraballo in the northern cone of Lima, Peru. I've been working in Africa. I've been working all over the world in trying to solve these problems, fundamental problems that Chile is asking itself right now. How do we create equality of opportunity for the poorest Chileans? How do we get to the point where people feel that no matter where they were born or who their parents are, they have a chance to really rise up in the world to the highest positions? And this is fundamentally what the World Bank does. And so for me, coming into the World Bank has been great because we have experts in roads and in energy and in agriculture, health, education. For a person like me who is a development junkie, I love thinking about and talking about development my whole life. To be in an organization with so many experts who've had so much experience has been just a fantastic experience.
I understand that 20 years ago you participated in a demonstration trying to close the World Bank. Is that true?
50 años es suficiente. That was the 50 years is enough. Yes, 20 years ago, this was at a time when the World Bank was focused on important things. We were focused on getting the macroeconomic fundamentals right. And we pushed forward programs that we called structural adjustment programs. And at that time, I think it was the right formula. If you'll remember, in the 90s, there was hyperinflation everywhere. There was tremendous problems and economic crises. And getting the economic fundamentals was right. But also at that time, the World Bank often found itself saying, as long as you focus on the macroeconomic fundamentals, as long as there's growth, everything else will fall into place. But everything else did not fall into place. And so now we're a completely different institution. We're leaders in the world on climate change. We're leaders in the world on gender equality. We're leaders in the world on ensuring that health, education, and social protection programs are in place and are being done in a way that really invests in human capital. So it's a completely different organization. And so at the end of the day, I'm very glad that we lost that argument about 50 years is enough.
So you don't think that you are betraying your ideals for being now in this position today?
No, I think we won the argument. I think, we were arguing that the World Bank, it's important, growth is important, but what have we learned from the Arab Spring, for example? We've learned that you can have a growing GDP, but have so much inequality and lack of inclusion inside the society that they literally blow up. I mean, the Arab Spring was about lack of access to jobs, lack of access to education that prepared them for the world. I mean, these were classic cases of growing GDP without inclusion. And so the evidence is overwhelming. And some of the research has been done right here by the Minister of Finance, Felipe Larraín. He has done research that showed that there is a growth benefit from more inclusive societies. So I think the World Bank is an institution that has done its research and has evolved as a result.
Let's talk about the economic situation right now. Is the growth of Chinese economy the main concern to the world economy?
Well, the Chinese economy has slowed, and it has gone from years of 10% growth to between 7 and 8% growth. And the markets have reacted. There's a lot of concern. And right now, China is going through a process where they're rethinking the sources of growth. So, for example, the World Bank wrote a document called China 2030. And we did this in collaboration with the current Premier Li Keqiang. He was really the champion of this report inside the Chinese government. And it says growth in the future has to be different. It has to be more focused on consumption. So when the Chinese focus more on growth through their own internal consumption, that's good news for everybody in the world, because that means that China will be importing products. China has to provide more competition to its state-owned enterprises. These are brand new ideas that we developed with the Chinese government that will take some time to implement. I have tremendous faith in the new leadership of China. I think they're extremely modern people. Li Keqiang speaks good English, for example. I spoke with him at quite a bit at length in English. And I think they have so many resources. Even though their debt to GDP is going up, they have so many reserves. And they have such an ability to make a decision and have it implemented all the way down the line that I still am quite optimistic that China will return to growth, to higher rates of growth in the future.
Because if China grows slowly, we will have lower demand for copper. The prices have already fell. Should we be worried about the future of copper and about the prices?
Well, for a country like Chile, that for 50% of your exports are on copper, fluctuations in the price of copper are a concern. But the Chileans have put together a very, very good mechanisms, and the way they've done it is rather than going up and down with the price of copper. If copper's priced high, the government spends a lot. If it's low, the government has to cut back. They've put in a stability mechanism so that in years where the copper prices are very high, they'll put some of the money away into the reserves to really level out the bumps and the ups and downs of the market. That's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. So of many countries that are copper exporters, we think Chile is extremely well prepared to weather these ups and downs in copper prices.
Which is the biggest problem today in South America, the main concern of the World Bank about South America?
Well, there are several concerns, but let me just talk about one of them. One of them that comes up again and again and again here is education, but education focused on truly introducing social mobility into the society. Our studies have shown that while Latin America has done really well in lifting people out of poverty, still going from poverty to being leaders of society, truly having the ability to be anything that you want to be, that's not there yet. And so what we would like to do is to work with Latin American countries so that any young person, so let's say a child is born in a village in the south of Chile or in the Amazon jungle in Peru. We want to help Latin American nations create societies in which that child grows up to say, I can be anything I want, because I'm going to have access to education, I'm going to have good health care, I'm going to have access to the best institutions of higher education, I can be anything I want. That is what we're hearing. That's what the people of Brazil are demanding right now. The good news is we think we can be very helpful in supporting Latin American countries to achieve just that.
Venezuela is a positive or a negative model for Latin America?
Well, I mean, Venezuela is in many ways an impossible model for many countries in Latin America, because very few people have the kind of oil resources that Venezuela has. We don't work in Venezuela right now, we would be open to doing so if we could make some kind of an arrangement, but we don't work in Venezuela right now. And we want to give certain kinds of messages. And the messages are this. You can be as creative as you want, and you can talk about anything that you want. Leaders do that. But there is the reality of the market. And so if you are too creative in the way that you deal with local industry, for example, taking them over or whatever, the market will respond, and your bond spreads, your borrowing costs will go up. I mean, this is just a reality of the world. The market is brutal in terms of responding to the activities of different governments. And so, if you have an independent source of wealth, then maybe you can do that. But the reality of the market's the reality of the market. And what we advise countries is to really think about how you insert yourself into the market. Because if everyone else is borrowing at 2%, and you're borrowing at 15 or 20%, it's going to be very hard for you to run your economy and to create the job that you want for the poorest. And so in some ways, the more creative approaches to economic management can lead to a situation where the poor are hurt the most. Look, I've spent all my life trying to provide services and support for the poorest people in Latin America. And so leaders have to, one, be very realistic about how markets work, and have to be very realistic about the fact that the private sector creates 90% of jobs. So every country in the world has to have an active, functioning, vibrant private sector. And an active, functioning, vibrant private sector has a lot to do with how fair-handed governments are in dealing with them. At the same time, in order to be competitive in the future, health, education, and social protection are critical. And among those, having great educational systems is what is going to determine who wins and loses in the next 5, 10, and 15 years.
You said that Venezuela is an impossible model for Latin America.
Just because very few have that kind of oil reserves that Venezuela does.
Chile is a possible model?
Well, again, Chile is very fortunate in having a third of all the copper reserves in the world. They're very fortunate in that sense. I think there are many things that have happened in Chile that are really good. I mean, the fact that over 20 years with different governments, the macroeconomic fundamentals have been very, very solid. Banking regulations have improved tremendously. Chile has had the experience of crisis, in the 70s and 80s, and I think they remember that. And because of that, they've developed very, very solid institutions. So from that perspective, I think that's been great. The fact that over different administrations, these macroeconomic fundamentals have been in place are great. Now, what Chile needs to do, and what every country needs to do, is to think hard about what are the next stages of economic development. So I was born in South Korea. South Korea has almost no natural resources. And so what the South Koreans are doing is every day, the government, the private sector, everyone are intensively talking to each other about what will be next. Black and white TVs, color TVs, computer chips, computers, and now cell phones. But the most recent export activity of Korea is culture. Everyone knows Gangnam Style. That was not an accident. The Korean movies, Korean music, K-pop, it's all over the place. But this happened because of a very specific focus of the private sector and the public sector to make culture an export.
The discussion about institutional reform and about tax reform in Chile with the campaign of Mrs. Bachelet is something that can affect private investment here in Chile?
Well, the private sector will be very clear. The private sector wants the governments to create an environment where they can flourish. And this is always the perspective of the private sector. And my strong recommendation is that to whoever becomes the next president of Chile, that they need to be in deep, deep conversation with all sectors. If there's a president coming from the left, they need to be sure to be talking with the private sector. And, in the past year, I spent a tremendous amount of time talking with leaders in the private sector. And the things that they want, I often find, are far more reasonable than the left imagines, right? So I think the most important thing for any new president of Chile is to make sure that if it's a right-wing president, they need to really reach out to civil society, NGOs, and the poor. If it's a left, they really need to have this conversation with the private sector.
Tax reform not necessarily affect investment, or it always affect investment?
There's an argument on that particular issue. And again, I think the question that the private sector always has is, all right, if you increase our taxes, what are we going to get in return for the increased taxes? This is an enormous problem throughout all of Latin America. In Brazil is a unique case. Their tax revenues are 35% of GDP. But if you go into some of the Latin America, the Central American countries, the tax revenues as percentage of GDP goes as low as 10, 11, 12%. And frankly, it's very difficult to run a government or a state with that low level of tax collection. So all countries have to think about a fair, just, well-communicated approach to strengthening their tax base so they can actually run their government. And I think the most important thing for any government is to say, okay, if we increase the taxes, if we increase the tax base, are we going to make sure that what the people get, what the private sector gets from these increased taxes is going to be worth it? There are ways to do it. We've seen it done very, very well in different parts of the world. And we just wish all Chileans the best of luck in figuring out the best mix of taxes and trade that will make this economy grow.
Finally, you are going now to Bolivia, but yesterday President Evo Morales said that we are better politically without the United States and we are better economically without the World Bank. What kind of reception is this?
We'll see. I mean, I'm looking forward to meeting him tomorrow morning. I'm very glad that he got back to Bolivia and is safe. I'm planning to talk to him about what we think we can bring to Bolivia. My own background, I was a protester against the World Bank Group. I've worked my entire life to try to improve the lives and improve access to healthcare, education of the poorest people in the world. And so I hope to communicate with him my very sincere and long history of doing this kind of work. But more than anything else, I want to make it clear to him that because we have experience in over 100 countries putting together programs, supporting countries in achieving goals very similar to his goals for his people, that just the fact that we can bring so much knowledge, experience, and data to the table should be helpful to him. It's up to him, of course, whether he accepts it or not.
Mr. President, thank you for this conversation with CNN.
Thank you, Daniel.
Y muchas gracias a ustedes por habernos acompañado también aquí en CNN con esta entrevista al presidente del Banco Mundial.